Welcome to the Unseen Shelf, where we uncover the hidden forces that have shaped history. Today, we explore Tomorrow, the World, The Birth of U.S. Global Supremacy by Stephen Wertheim, a book that challenges everything we think we know about America's rise to global dominance. Was the United States always destined to rule the world? Or was its path to superpower status a deliberate choice made in the crucible of World War II? Wertheim argues that before the war, America stood at a crossroads, hesitant, inward-looking, and resistant to empire. Yet, by the war's end, it had embraced a mission of global leadership that would define the modern world. Through meticulous research, Wertheim reveals how policymakers, intellectuals, and military strategists reshaped American foreign policy, abandoning isolationism in favor of unchallenged global supremacy. This transformation was not inevitable. It was a calculated decision, made by those who believed the world's future rested in American hands. But was this shift a necessary safeguard or an overreach? And what does it mean for us today? To understand this turning point, we must go back to a time when the United States was still hesitant about its global role. The story begins in the early days of World War II, as American leaders grappled with the question, should the United States remain a regional power, or should it seize the opportunity to shape a new world order? As war raged across Europe and the Pacific, the foundations of American supremacy were being laid, decisions that would redefine the nation and the world. Let's step into that moment in history and witness the birth of U.S. global dominance. The Decision for Dominance, Chapter 1 reveals how, amid the chaos of World War II, American leaders made a pivotal choice, not just to win the war, but to shape the world that would follow, marking the first step toward U.S. global supremacy. In the opening days of 1940, the United States was still a nation at a crossroads. The world beyond its shores was aflame. Germany had unleashed its military might across Europe. Britain stood alone against the Axis onslaught, and in the Pacific, Japan's imperial ambitions loomed large. Yet, across the vast American continent, the mood remained uncertain. The scars of World War I were still raw, and the prevailing sentiment among its people and policymakers was one of restraint. The United States, for all its economic and industrial strength, had no grand ambitions of world leadership. It was a country that valued its security, but remained hesitant to engage in the great power struggles that had defined European history for centuries. But in the halls of Washington, a quiet revolution was already beginning. A small but influential group of strategists, intellectuals, and government officials were coming to a stark realization: if the United States did not shape the post-war order, someone else would. And that possibility was unacceptable. For decades, American foreign policy had been rooted in two seemingly opposing forces: isolationism and interventionism. On the one hand, the country had long adhered to the principle of avoiding entangling alliances, a doctrine stretching back to George Washington's farewell address. Yet, at the same time, the nation had never truly been detached from global affairs. It had expanded across the continent, fought wars in the Caribbean and the Pacific, and exerted its influence in Latin America. The contradiction was apparent. America was both a reluctant empire and an emerging superpower. As war consumed Europe once more, the debate over America's role in the world reached a turning point. President Franklin D. Roosevelt, keenly aware of the stakes, began maneuvering the nation toward a more active role. He spoke not just of military necessity, but of a grander vision, an international order led by the United States, ensuring both peace and stability in a world that had seen too much destruction. By mid-1940, the fall of France sent shockwaves through Washington. If Hitler could bring the mighty French army to its knees in just 6 weeks, what did that mean for the future of democracy? Britain now stood alone, and there was no guarantee it could hold out. American leaders, particularly within Roosevelt's administration, saw a chilling possibility. Should Britain fall, Nazi Germany would dominate Europe, while Japan continued its unchecked expansion in Asia. The world would be carved up between totalitarian regimes, and America, even with its vast oceans, could not remain untouched. But beyond the immediate war effort, another question lingered: what kind of world would emerge if the Allies were victorious? Would the United States retreat into its shell once more, as it had after World War I, allowing instability to fester? Or would it seize the moment to shape the international system, ensuring that no future war of this scale could threaten its security? This was the decision for dominance. Not one made on a single day, nor by a single individual, but rather a shift in thinking that took hold among policymakers, academics, and military strategists. The old debate of isolationism versus interventionism gave way to a new reality. If America wanted peace, it would have to lead. If it sought security, it would have to build an order that only it could guarantee. Roosevelt, ever the master strategist, began laying the foundation for this transformation. In speeches, he spoke not just of winning the war, but of what would come after. The idea of a permanent American role in world affairs was no longer an abstract debate. It was becoming a necessity. By the end of 1940, the United States had already begun its pivot toward global supremacy. The decision was not yet fully realized, but the groundwork was being laid. The architects of this new order, officials in the State Department, military planners, and economic thinkers, were already sketching the blueprints for an American-led world. They did not yet know what form it would take, nor the full consequences of their choices, but one thing was clear: the age of American dominance had begun. Chapter 2 explores internationalism before isolationism, which is the year from 1776 to 1940. It traces the evolution of American internationalism, showing how the nation's foreign policy shifted from hesitant engagement to an emerging vision of global leadership long before isolationism became a dominant narrative. The idea of American isolationism has long been taken as fact, a guiding principle that shaped the nation's foreign policy until World War II forced it to abandon its detachment from the world. But this perception, as Stephen Wertheim argues, is far from the truth. The United States was never truly isolated. From its earliest days, the nation balanced a cautious approach to foreign entanglements with an unmistakable drive for expansion, influence, and security beyond its borders. The founding of the United States was itself an international event. The revolution that birthed the nation was entangled in European power struggles, with France and Spain playing crucial roles in aiding the colonies against Britain. Yet, once independence was secured, the U.S. sought to define its place in the world, task fraught with contradictions. On the one hand, George Washington's farewell address warned against permanent alliances, reinforcing a belief in non-intervention. On the other, the young republic quickly set about expanding its reach, forging economic ties abroad, and asserting influence in the Western Hemisphere. The Monroe Doctrine of 1823 was one of the clearest expressions of America's early internationalism. It was not a declaration of isolation, but rather a warning to European powers that the Western Hemisphere was off-limits to further colonization. This doctrine asserted a form of regional dominance, an early indication that the U.S. saw itself as a key player in shaping the geopolitical landscape, even if it avoided direct military entanglements across the Atlantic. Throughout the 19th century, America's outward reach continued. The expansion across the continent, wars with Mexico and Spain, and growing economic influence in Latin America all demonstrated that the U.S. was far from detached from world affairs. By the dawn of the 20th century, it had secured overseas territories, fought in conflicts beyond its borders, and emerged as a rising economic power. The turning point came in 1917 when the United States entered World War I. President Woodrow Wilson framed the war as a battle not just for victory, but for a new world order. His vision of the League of Nations sought to embed the U.S. in global governance, ensuring lasting peace through collective security. But after the war ended, a fierce debate erupted at home. Many Americans, weary of foreign conflicts, rejected the League, and the Senate refused to ratify the Treaty of Versailles. Wilson's vision of international leadership crumbled, and in its place emerged what would later be labeled isolationism. Yet, as Wertheim reveals, this retreat was not a return to old principles. It was a new idea entirely. Before World War I, few Americans had ever defined their country as isolationist. It was only after the League of Nations debate that the term took hold, as politicians and intellectuals sought to explain why the U.S. had withdrawn from global commitments. In truth, America remained deeply engaged in international affairs throughout the 1920s and 1930s. It shaped global finance, brokered diplomatic agreements, and maintained military and economic influence, even as it avoided direct military intervention in Europe's growing tensions. By the late 1930s, with war once again engulfing Europe, the debate over America's role intensified. Should it intervene? Should it maintain neutrality? The rise of Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan made the question unavoidable. But Wertheim argues that what followed was not a rejection of isolationism, but rather a continuation of America's long history of strategic engagement. The difference this time was that instead of cautious expansion or economic influence, the U.S. was on the brink of something much larger, full-scale global leadership. As 1940 arrived, the pieces were already moving. American policymakers no longer debated whether they should shape the world order, but how they should do so. The shift away from isolationism was not a break with the past, but rather the culmination of a process that had been unfolding for over a century. The United States had never been isolated. It had always been engaged in international affairs. Now, it would simply take the lead. Chapter 3 explores how the outbreak of World War II, particularly between May and December 1940, forced American policymakers to confront the urgent need for a new world order, setting the stage for the nation's decisive turn toward global supremacy. The spring of 1940 shattered any lingering illusions that the world could return to its old order. War had engulfed Europe, but this time, it moved with terrifying speed. In a matter of weeks, Hitler's forces overwhelmed Denmark and Norway. By May, the unthinkable happened. Germany launched its invasion of France. The Maginot Line, once believed to be an impenetrable fortress, proved useless as German tanks blitzed through the Ardennes. Paris fell in June, and with it, the last semblance of European stability crumbled. For American leaders watching from across the Atlantic, the implications were stark. The fall of France meant that Britain now stood alone. If it too succumbed, Nazi Germany would control the entire continent, free to shape the world as it saw fit. The United States, long hesitant to involve itself in Europe's conflicts, now faced a new reality, a world dominated by totalitarian regimes. President Franklin D. Roosevelt understood that the stakes had changed. Even as public sentiment remained wary of direct involvement, he and his advisors saw no path forward where America could remain untouched. The war was no longer just a European affair. It was a fight that would determine the future of global order. Yet, in mid-1940, America was not ready for war. Its military was vastly underprepared, its strategic thinking still rooted in the old debates of intervention versus isolation. But behind closed doors, a transformation was underway. Roosevelt and key officials, including Secretary of State Cordell Hull and Undersecretary Sumner Welles, began laying the groundwork for an American-led world order. The turning point came in July. British Prime Minister Winston Churchill, desperate for support, appealed directly to Roosevelt. Britain had the will to fight but lacked the means. If America did not step in, the war might be lost before it had even begun. Roosevelt, while still facing a cautious public, responded with a landmark decision, the Destroyers for Bases Agreement. The United States would provide Britain with aging naval destroyers in exchange for military bases in the Caribbean and North Atlantic. It was a masterstroke. America strengthened its strategic position while aiding Britain, all without formally entering the war. But Roosevelt knew that weapons alone would not be enough. If the United States was to emerge as the guardian of the free world, it needed a vision, one that extended beyond simply defeating the Axis. Throughout the summer and fall of 1940, administration officials began reshaping American policy, no longer debating whether they should intervene, but how to construct a post-war world in which the United States held the reins. The idea of world order took shape in these months. While the League of Nations had failed in its mission after World War I, policymakers now envision a more robust international structure, one where American power would be institutionalized, ensuring global stability under its leadership. The days of temporary engagement followed by retreat were over. In September, Germany, Italy, and Japan signed the Tripartite Pact, formalizing their alliance. The Axis was now a coordinated threat, reinforcing the urgency for American involvement. Roosevelt responded with an even bolder move, the Selective Service Act, the first peacetime draft in U.S. history. It was a clear message. America was preparing for war, whether the public was ready or not. As December approached, the transformation was nearly complete. The once vibrant debate over isolationism faded. Military buildup accelerated, economic mobilization began, and American leaders spoke openly of the world that would emerge after victory. Even without a formal declaration of war, the United States had already positioned itself as the architect of a new global order. By the end of 1940, the United States was no longer asking whether it should shape the world. It was actively doing so. The war had become more than just a battle for survival. It was a battle for dominance. The world of tomorrow will be built on the decisions made in these critical months, as America took its first irreversible steps toward global supremacy. The Americo-British New Order of 1941, Chapter 4 examines how, in 1941, the United States and Britain worked together to envision a new global order, with American policymakers crafting the foundations of a post-war world where U.S. dominance would be institutionalized and unchallenged. By 1941, the old world was collapsing. The Axis powers were tightening their grip on Europe and Asia, and Britain, though still standing, was battered and clinging to American aid for survival. The United States, though not yet at war, was already shaping the conflict's outcome. But beyond the immediate battles, another war was being fought, a war over what the world would look like once the fighting stopped. Would power return to the old European empires? Would a fractured balance of power lead to another global crisis? Or would the United States seize the moment to create an entirely new international order? In Washington and London, the answer was becoming clear. The future belonged to America. President Franklin D. Roosevelt and British Prime Minister Winston Churchill had been corresponding for months, their relationship built on mutual necessity. Britain needed American weapons, supplies, and support to keep Hitler at bay. The United States, meanwhile, needed a partner to help shape its vision of a post-war world, one where American power would not only be projected across the globe but institutionalized into the very fabric of the international system. The key moment came in August 1941, when Roosevelt and Churchill met in secret aboard a naval ship off the coast of Newfoundland. Over the course of days, they hammered out what would become known as the Atlantic Charter, a document that, on the surface, laid out their shared vision for a peaceful post-war world. It spoke of self-determination, open trade, disarmament, and the rejection of territorial expansion. To the public, it was framed as a commitment to the principles of democracy and freedom. But beneath its idealistic language, the Atlantic Charter was something more. It was a roadmap for American-led global dominance. While Churchill saw the Charter as a way to secure American support for Britain's war effort, Roosevelt had bigger plans. The Charter subtly laid the groundwork for dismantling old empires, particularly the British Empire. The principles of self-determination, so proudly proclaimed, would one day be used to justify the decolonization movements that would strip Britain of its imperial holdings. Roosevelt understood that if the United States was to shape the post-war world, it could not do so as a junior partner to Britain. It had to be the undisputed leader. At home, American policymakers were already working toward this goal. In early 1941, the Lend-Lease Act had been passed, allowing the U.S. to send military aid to Britain and other allied nations. This was more than just an arms deal. It was a declaration that America was the world's arsenal, the indispensable nation without which victory was impossible. Roosevelt framed it as an act of necessity, but in reality, it was a calculated step toward global supremacy. As the year progressed, American involvement in the war deepened. In July 1941, Roosevelt ordered U.S. troops to occupy Iceland, securing a critical North Atlantic position. The Navy began escorting British convoys, engaging in skirmishes with German U-boats, acts of war in all but name. Yet the American public, still hesitant about full-scale conflict, remained largely unaware that their country was already waging an undeclared war. Meanwhile, in the State Department and military planning rooms, discussions were shifting. No longer was the question whether the U.S. would shape the post-war world, it was how it would do so. A new international system was being envisioned, one where American economic and military might would be the backbone of global stability. But one major obstacle remained: Japan. Even as Roosevelt and Churchill mapped out the future, tensions in the Pacific were escalating. Japan's imperial expansion threatened American strategic interests, particularly in Southeast Asia and the Pacific Islands. By November 1941, Washington was preparing for the inevitable. An oil embargo had been imposed on Japan, crippling its economy and leaving its leaders with two choices: submit to American demands or strike first. On December 7, 1941, the decision came. Japan launched a surprise attack on Pearl Harbor, killing over 2,400 Americans and dragging the United States into the war. The debate over intervention was over. The World War was now America's war, and with it, the opportunity to build a new world order was fully realized. By the end of 1941, the transformation was complete. The Atlantic Charter had signaled America's intention to lead. Lend-Lease had established its role as the lifeline of global security. Pearl Harbor had provided the final push into war. The United States was no longer a hesitant power. It was now the architect of a future where it alone would stand as the world's dominant force. The old empires would fade. The world would be reshaped. And at the center of it all, America would rise. Chapter 5 is getting into year from 1941 to 1943, which is instrumental internationalism. This explores how, between 1941 and 1943, U.S. policymakers strategically framed internationalism as a means of securing American dominance, ensuring that global institutions would serve U.S. interests while maintaining the illusion of collective security. By 1941, the war was no longer just about defeating the Axis. In Washington, another struggle was unfolding, one not fought with bullets or bombs, but with ideas and strategy. The United States had entered the conflict knowing it would emerge victorious, and with that certainty came an urgent question: what would come next? For nearly 2 centuries, the nation had walked a fine line between engagement and restraint, shaping world affairs without fully embracing the role of global leader. But now there would be no stepping back. The world after the war would not be left to fate. It would be designed, constructed, and led by the United States. Yet to sustain such dominance, force alone would not be enough. Empires of the past had ruled through conquest and direct control, but American power had to appear different. It had to be wrapped in something more palatable, something that did not look like empire but functioned like one. It would be called internationalism. The idea was simple yet powerful. The United States would present itself as a champion of global cooperation, ensuring peace and stability through shared institutions, while quietly securing its place as the ultimate authority within them. Even before the first American troops landed on European shores, policymakers had begun drafting the blueprint for a new global order. The League of Nations had failed, but its fundamental idea, an international system to prevent war, could be revived, this time with the United States firmly in control. In January 1942, 26 Allied nations signed the Declaration by United Nations, a pledge not only to fight the Axis but to work together for the future. On the surface, it was a promise of unity. In reality, it was the first step toward embedding American leadership into the post-war world. Economic dominance would be just as crucial as military strength. The Great Depression had shown how financial instability could lead to chaos, and the Roosevelt administration was determined to ensure that the post-war economy would be built on American terms. In July 1944, as battles raged across Europe and the Pacific, representatives from 44 nations met at Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, to determine the structure of the global financial system. From this meeting, the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank were born, institutions that promised economic stability and development. But beneath the surface, their function was clear. These institutions would operate under American influence, ensuring that no future economic collapse could occur without Washington's oversight. More importantly, the U.S. dollar was cemented as the world's reserve currency. From that moment forward, international trade, loans, and economic aid would be tied to the American financial system. No matter what happened on the battlefield, the United States had already secured economic primacy. While diplomats built the foundation for financial control, military strategists worked to ensure that American power would have a physical presence across the globe. The old pattern of fighting wars and then retreating would not be repeated. This time, the United States would remain. By 1943, the groundwork was in place for a permanent military footprint. U.S. bases stretched across Europe, the Pacific, and beyond. Troops were stationed not as temporary occupiers, but as the enforcers of a new world order. The strategy was clear. A network of American military power would guarantee that no major global conflict could unfold without U.S. involvement. Even in peace, America's military presence would be felt in every corner of the world. Convincing the American public, however, was another matter. For decades, isolationism had been a dominant sentiment, and while Pearl Harbor had shattered much of that reluctance, there remained a deep-seated belief that America should not entangle itself too deeply in foreign affairs. Roosevelt and his administration understood that if the public saw this as an act of empire building, resistance would grow. The story had to be framed differently. This was not about dominance, they insisted, but about stability. It was not about American control, but about preventing future wars. Newspapers, radio broadcasts, and films all carried the message that the United States had a responsibility to lead, not for its own benefit, but for the good of the world. Internationalism was not an extension of power. It was the only path to peace. By the end of 1943, the transformation was nearly complete. Isolationism was no longer a serious position in Washington. The institutions of global governance were being molded under American influence. Economic structures were designed to keep the United States at the center. Military presence had shifted from wartime necessity to long-term strategy. What had once been a country hesitant to intervene in world affairs was now positioning itself as the indispensable leader of a new world order. The war was still being fought, but its outcome had already been decided, not just in terms of victory over the Axis, but in terms of who would shape the world that followed. American supremacy was no longer a question of if, but of how it would be managed. The age of instrumental internationalism had begun, and with it, the final steps toward an American-dominated world. Chapter 6 reveals how, between 1942 and 1945, the supposed debate over America's global role was largely an illusion, as policymakers had already committed to U.S. supremacy, ensuring that internationalism was framed not as a choice, but as an inevitability. By 1942, the United States was fully at war, its industries producing weapons at an unprecedented pace, its armies mobilizing across Europe and the Pacific. The question of whether America should lead the post-war world seemed, on the surface, open for debate. Politicians spoke of different possibilities, newspapers presented contrasting opinions, and public discussions centered on what role the nation should play once the war was over. But beneath this veneer of discussion, the decision had already been made. The idea that America had ever truly considered returning to isolation was a fiction. From the moment Pearl Harbor had been attacked, policymakers, military planners, and economic strategists had worked under the assumption that the world after the war would be shaped by the United States. What appeared to be a national debate about America's future was, in reality, a managed transition, one in which the public would be led to see global leadership not as an option, but as an inevitability. The Roosevelt administration understood that such a transformation could not be rushed. The American people had long been wary of entanglements beyond their borders, and any suggestion that the United States was building an empire would be met with resistance. Instead, the argument had to be framed differently. This was not about power, but responsibility. It was not about dominance, but duty. The world, Americans were told, could not afford another cycle of war and collapse. If the U.S. withdrew, the result would be chaos, just as it had been after World War I. Only American leadership could guarantee peace, prosperity, and security. In Washington, this message was carefully constructed. The press was guided to emphasize the dangers of disengagement. Hollywood, working closely with the government, produced films that portrayed America as the stabilizing force in an unstable world. Roosevelt's speeches, filled with grand visions of democracy and freedom, laid the foundation for a new global order, one in which the United States would take the lead, not for its own gain, but for the survival of civilization itself. While the public was being prepared for this new reality, behind closed doors, the machinery of global leadership was being built. In 1944, as American and Allied forces pushed toward victory, high-level planning intensified. Economic structures like the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank had already been established to ensure that financial power remained in American hands. The military was securing permanent bases across the world, ensuring that no future conflict could unfold without U.S. involvement. The political framework was next. The idea of a new international institution, one that would replace the failed League of Nations, had been circulating among American and British policymakers for years. But now, with victory in sight, its details were being finalized. This organization would not simply be a forum for diplomacy. It would be a tool for ensuring U.S. influence over global affairs. The United Nations, as it would soon be called, was presented as a body of equal nations working together for peace. But its structure was designed with a clear hierarchy, one where the United States and a handful of its allies would hold the real power. As 1945 approached, the illusion of debate faded. By now, even those who had once championed isolationism had largely fallen in line. The war had demonstrated the dangers of disengagement, they argued. America could not afford to step back. Even the Republican opposition, which had previously resisted Roosevelt's internationalist vision, began to accept the new order, realizing that to oppose it would mean political isolation. The final confirmation came in April 1945, when delegates from 50 nations gathered in San Francisco to establish the United Nations. Roosevelt did not live to see its formal creation. He died that same month. But his vision had already been realized. The United States was not simply a participant in the post-war world. It was its architect. The institutions, the alliances, the military presence, the economic power, all of it had been carefully positioned to ensure that American leadership would not be temporary. It would be permanent. By the time World War II officially ended in September 1945, the transformation was complete. The question of America's role in the world was no longer a matter of discussion. The age of U.S. global supremacy had begun, not through conquest or brute force, but through careful planning, strategic messaging, and the quiet dismantling of any opposition. The world did not simply invite American leadership, it had been shaped to demand it. A distinctly American internationalism, which is the final chapter of this book, concludes how, in the aftermath of World War II, the United States solidified its global supremacy not through conquest, but by embedding its power into international institutions, economic systems, and security alliances, making American leadership seem not like a choice, but an inevitability. The war had ended, but the world it left behind was unrecognizable. Cities lay in ruins, empires had collapsed, and the old balance of power had been shattered. The United States, untouched by the destruction that had ravaged Europe and Asia, now stood alone as the dominant force. Its economy was the strongest in history, its military spanned the globe, and its influence reached into every aspect of international politics. Yet, for all its strength, America did not declare itself an empire. It did not seek to rule openly, nor did it claim to dictate the fate of nations by force. Instead, it offered something new, an internationalism that was unmistakably American, a world order that was framed as cooperation but functioned as control. The creation of the United Nations in 1945 was the final stroke in this grand strategy. Presented to the world as a forum of equals, it was, in reality, a carefully designed structure that ensured U.S. dominance. The Security Council, with its system of permanent members and veto power, guaranteed that no major decision could be made without American approval. The Bretton Woods system, established a year earlier, had already bound the global economy to the U.S. dollar. The Marshall Plan, introduced in 1947, further solidified this dominance by rebuilding war-torn Europe under American economic influence. It was a system that worked not through direct conquest, but through necessity. War had left Europe and Asia in desperate need of stability, and only the United States could provide it. Nations that had once been global powers, Britain, France, Germany, Japan, were now dependent on American economic aid, American military protection, and American political leadership. Even the Soviet Union, the only other great power to emerge from the war, found itself reacting to a world that had already been shaped by American priorities. But this system had to be sold to the American people, many of whom had spent decades believing that foreign entanglements led only to disaster. Isolationism had been defeated in Washington, but in the minds of ordinary Americans, it was not yet fully dead. Roosevelt had understood this better than anyone. His speeches had framed American leadership not as ambition, but as responsibility. Now, with Roosevelt gone, his successors had to reinforce the idea that global supremacy was not only necessary but natural. The story told to the American people was simple. The world had seen what happened when America withdrew after World War I. That mistake could not be repeated. If the United States did not lead, chaos would follow. Communism would spread unchecked. The economies of Europe and Asia would collapse. Another war would be inevitable. The only solution was for America to remain engaged, to shape the world in its own image, to protect democracy, to prevent the rise of new threats. This argument became the foundation of American foreign policy for decades to come. The Cold War, which began almost immediately after the end of World War II, provided the perfect justification. The Soviet Union was cast as an existential enemy, an ideological force that had to be countered at all costs. Every intervention, every alliance, every military presence was justified as a defense against the spread of communism. In reality, these actions ensured that U.S. power remained unchallenged. By the late 1940s, the transformation was complete. America's global role was no longer in question. Its military bases stretched from Germany to Japan. Its economic influence dictated the policies of half the world. Its institutions, from the United Nations to the World Bank, had become the pillars of the modern world order. What had once been a nation wary of foreign involvement was now the unquestioned leader of the free world. This was the final stage of America's rise to supremacy, not through brute force, not through conquest, but through a system so deeply embedded that it no longer needed to be debated. It had become reality. The United States had not only shaped the world, it had made itself indispensable to it. Today, we have explored the birth of U.S. global supremacy. The key messages from this book is that the world emerged from World War II was not shaped by chance, but by deliberate design. The United States, once hesitant about its role beyond its borders, had cemented itself as the undisputed global leader, not through territorial conquest, but through economic influence, military presence, and the careful construction of international institutions that ensured its dominance. What had once been framed as a debate had, by the war's end, become an inevitability. The American-led world order was now a reality, one that would define global politics for generations to come. The question was no longer whether the United States would lead, but how it would wield its power in the decades ahead. Thank you for your time and thoughtful engagement. If you have any reflections, insights, or topics you'd like to explore further, we'd love to hear from you. We look forward to seeing you again for our next book discussion. If you enjoyed this content, your support through a subscription and a like is truly appreciated. We will see you soon with the next book.